So in this video, I am going to be explaining what the binding agreement date is. So let's get right into it. When you're purchasing a home, once you and the seller come to terms and you've signed the contract, there is a space on that contract for one of the agents to fill in the binding agreement date. So what exactly is that? The binding agreement date is the date that the party who accepted the most recent offer or counteroffer notifies the other party that their offer or counteroffer has been accepted. That is the simplest way to explain the binding agreement date. Now, where confusion comes in is if notice of the acceptance is delayed for some reason. And this actually happens more frequently than you might expect. So let me give you an example. You and the seller have been negotiating, and let's just say that the point of contention is the amount of closing costs that the seller is going to pay. You wanted the seller to pay $10,000 in closing costs. The seller only wants to pay $5,000 in closing costs. They sent you a counteroffer for that $5,000. You sent them a counter to their counter for $7,500, and they accept your counteroffer of $7,500. They sign the documents, but it's Christmas Eve. Their agent doesn't return that signed counteroffer to your agent until December 27th. And they have filled in a binding agreement date of December 24th because that's the day that their client signed the document. The problem is this: you weren't notified. And when I say you, I mean your agent, you weren't notified of that acceptance for 3 days. Why is this important? Because all of the deadlines, all of the milestones in that purchase and sale agreement run from the binding agreement date. In most instances, there are some exceptions. So, in effect, you have lost 3 days. So, what happens if there is a disagreement as to what the binding agreement date is? Well, you have 1 day, literally 1 day, from the date that you receive notice of the binding agreement date to notify the other party of your objection. And the two of you have to negotiate and come to terms on what the actual binding agreement date is and sign an amendment that sets forth what the actual binding agreement date is. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that on the purchase and sale agreement, there is a space for one of the agents, and it can be either of the agents, to fill in the binding agreement date. There is also a document called Notice of Binding Agreement Date that the parties, that one party, the party giving notice that the contract has been accepted, can fill out that specifies what the binding agreement date is. Either one of these options or both is acceptable. And in my experience, most agents don't use that Notice of Binding Agreement Date document, but it's probably a good idea to do it, especially if there is concern about what the actual binding agreement date is. What if the binding agreement date on that counteroffer had been left blank? Then your agent, you're the buyer, could complete that Notice of Binding Agreement Date document, put in December 27th because that's the day that you received notice that your counteroffer had been accepted, and email that over to the listing agent. All parties are on notice that the binding agreement date is December 27th.